You're listening to Ancient Faith Radio, your Orthodox Internet radio connection.
Welcome to Live with the Louhs with your hosts, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, our work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live with the Louhs. My name is Father Nicholas Lowe, and I'm joined by my lovely wife and co-host, Dr. Roxanne Lowe.
Good evening, everyone. So happy to be with you this evening.
She is, we're experiencing a little bit of technical difficulty, so hopefully in a few moments she'll pop up on the screen. But we're so grateful that you're joining us on this Tuesday, October 24th. And if you're new to Live with the Louhs, it's a show that merges both faith and psychology to really give you some practical steps that you can live and apply in your own walk of faith. So once again, thanks so much for joining us. Before we talk into tonight's really important topic, I do want to invite all of you, as I do every week, to stay connected to us on our social media platforms. Friends, we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, all under the headings of the Louhs. In fact, you can check out all of our sermons. They're all archived on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to it by going to youtube.com and then simply putting in the search engine the Louhs. And that last name is spelled Louhs. And also check out our website. We've got all of the different things about where we're going, our retreats, our just information about who we are and what we're all about. You can find us on our website at thelouhs.com. And finally, as I share every single week, and especially in these days and times where we turn on the news for a little bit and it just, all we see is horror, all we see is so much sadness and doom and gloom. For many of us, we can use a little break. We can use a little inspiration. And so several years ago, Roxanne and I began sending out these daily words of encouragement, and with the hope and the prayer that these messages would inspire and encourage you all. If you're interested in receiving one of our daily inspirational messages that we send out every single day at 7 a.m. Eastern Time to your email inbox, go to our website at thelouhs.com/subscribe, or just simply find the subscribe button, which is in the top right corner of our website, and simply put in your email address. And then every single day you'll get one of these words of encouragement. And again, we want to make a difference in this world, friends. So if you know of someone that could use that, forward those emails to them and encourage them also to join our family as well. And as always, every one of our shows, we truly value your input, your conversation. And so feel free to call us at any point during the show at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or feel free to email me a question during the live broadcast of our show at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. So let's get started. You know, friends, today I want to talk to you about clergy wellness. You know, we're living in some very difficult and emotional, stressful times in our world. All of us can see the horror that is taking place on the news. We see the struggles that are happening with families, where every 13 seconds, a recent study found that couples are filing for divorce. We see levels of depression and anxiety and fear is up. We see record levels of medications being taken. In fact, it seems as though everything that is bad is up. We can all experience that. But one segment of society that we oftentimes don't talk about or don't realize that they too are going through this is our clergy. Not only our clergy, but also their spouses, the pastor, the priest. In fact, I was reading a study that recently said that the third highest level of post-traumatic stress disorder after first responders and our military are clergy. And in one statistic that was done in 2013, a study from the Schaeffer Institute found that 1,700 pastors leave the ministry each month, citing depression, burnout, or being overworked as the primary reasons. According to the study, 90% of pastors report working 55 to 70 hours a week, and 50% of them feel unable to meet the demands of the job. To make matters worse, friends, we're seeing higher levels of clergy divorce and separation, as well as feelings of isolation and loneliness. what's happening with our clergy, what's happening with their families, and what should we all be doing about it. Today I'm talking to a dear friend of mine. In fact, you may not all know this, but when I was at the seminary, I was blessed to take a class with this gentleman that we're talking about tonight, Dr. George Stavros, who inspired me so much that I would, upon graduation, would do a doctorate of ministry program in pastoral counseling. That's how much of an inspiration he was for me. So I'm very, very blessed to have him on our show. And before I invite him on the show, I do want to just tell you a little bit about why he's so special to me and why he's so special to us as a church. George Stavros, Dr. George Stavros, is a licensed psychologist who works at the Danielsen Institute, and we'll talk about that in a few moments, at Boston University as a psychologist and its executive director since 2009. His vocational journey as a clinician started at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, where coursework, mentoring, and the rhythmic spiritual life of Eastern Orthodox Christianity helped guide him towards his doctoral studies in pastoral psychology at Boston University. Prior to returning to BU, he spent 6 years working as a psychologist and director of the Evening Intensive Outpatient Program at Two Brattle Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His clinical work has focused on adolescents, young adults, couples, and clergy, and he has benefited greatly from working in clinical training settings throughout his career. And so, Dr. George, welcome. It's such an honor to have you with us. Welcome to Live with the Louhs.
It is such a pleasure to be here with you, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne. I can't tell you what a thrill it is. I know we're here to talk about some serious things, but it's going to be with a full and grateful heart that I'm doing that.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much. So, let's just start first off with telling us a little bit about the Danielsen Institute. Just tell us a little bit about what it's about, what inspires you about it. I know you're obviously working as the executive director, but how did you get engaged with it? And tell us what its purpose in ministry is.
Sure. So the Danielsen Institute is a center that is part of Boston University, but it's got a very unique place in that it was the culmination of a vision of a particular family, a particular couple, as a matter of fact, Albert and Jessie Danielsen, who back in the early 50s thought that clergy would benefit from having training in counseling skills as part of their pastoral care abilities. So they gave some money to the Boston University School of Theology, to a professor named Paul Johnson, and that little seed program did really well. And the Danielsens, from that point, ended up giving quite a bit of money, enough to create an endowment within the university to establish their institute, the Danielsen Institute, where I'm sitting right now talking to you from. What they envisioned was an institute that would benefit from a place in a large research university and yet really be designed to serve and to teach. So since 1952, it's grown a lot. And its mission now is to provide clinical services to people in the greater Boston community. So we're a community, outpatient community mental health center right here on campus. Its second mission is to provide training to mental health practitioners who have an interest in and a commitment to religious and spiritual life and its importance in people's lives. And when I say importance, that could very much be a positive influence, but also to understand the ways in which religion and spirituality can negatively affect people, sometimes even in traumatic ways. So we welcome fellows from all over the country who come and work here for 2 years and engage in this kind of intensive interdisciplinary training. And then the third arm of the Institute is our research center, which really has picked up a lot of momentum over the past 10 years or so with the arrival of a research director, Steve Sandage. And the mission of the research center is to kind of do the empirical scientific work of looking at ways in which religion and spirituality and mental health are connected to one another. Now, because the Danielsens originally had that interest in clergy and clergy family well-being, that's remained a part of what we do all along. So we see and work with a lot of clergy clinically here. Some of our training fellows are clergy who come here, and our research center does a lot of work specifically studying well-being in clergy and clergy families.
So let's talk about clergy families. What are some of the unique pressures that you see facing people in ministry, especially from a psychological standpoint?
Well, there's certainly unique pressures on clergy and clergy families. And I probably would have answered this somewhat similarly pre-COVID, but that's added a whole layer, I think, to the pressures, Dr. Roxanne. The ones that have stayed pretty steady since we started doing our work on clergy families back in 2010 are things like the boundaries around clergy persons and their families are different than with most professionals. There's a way in which there's an expectation oftentimes in communities that there's access to clergy and their families, an assumption of familiarity, an assumption of, and in some more extreme cases, like an entitlement to their attention, to their time, in a way that doesn't recognize the needs of any person or family to be able to have some expectable boundaries and ways to disconnect from their workplace. That's a really unique aspect of clergy life and clergy family life. And depending on the denomination, depending on the community, that can mostly fall on the clergy person themselves. But oftentimes it ends up including their family members as well, their spouse, their children. And so that's one particular one. I'd say another one is that clergy really are, at least in our American context, they're first responders. They are the first phone call so many people make in the context of crisis, trauma, death, accidents, marital, relational crises. That's so often the first call that gets made, and it's coming into a person who deeply cares about the community and the people in the community, but certainly doesn't have necessarily, unless they've done what you've done, Father Nicholas, and gone and gotten the training, have the kind of training necessary to really triage and sort through what needs to happen when people are experiencing a high level of stress, even traumatic stress. So what can often happen there, and I can say more about this later, but something called vicarious traumatization can become an issue for clergy and to their families to some extent, but particularly to clergy. And vicarious traumatization is just the buildup of experiences of hearing about and dealing with situations in which there are really overwhelming and unbearable feelings and occurrences taking place. And the way that the human body, the human mind, the human soul, the human psyche responds to that kind of regular exposure to that level of traumatic stress it's very difficult to deal with that.
Right, and then as you were speaking, I couldn't help but go back to that study that we were sharing earlier on by the Schaeffer Institute, where 1,700 pastors are leaving the ministry each month. I mean, citing depression, burnout, or being overworked. And I think as a priest, I know that in my own personal life, and I think I don't think it's just unique to us. I think there are certain maybe predispositions that certain personalities have that can create that level of burnout. But there's not really a finish line. You're always on call. You're always needing to be available for that call. And I think so much, I think for a lot of people, and I'm curious to see if, with the pastors that are actually coming to you as patients or that are coming to you or their spouses for that matter, are you hearing that level of burnout? And if so, was it worse post-COVID or are we seeing the same pre and post-COVID? Because I read some statistics that said that post-COVID, those numbers even went up higher. So maybe talk a little bit about that if you don't mind.
Sure. So I'm going to answer you in two ways. One is going to be from a research perspective, and one will be from the clinical perspective. From a research perspective, we got into this initially with a fairly large research study of Greek Orthodox clergy in 2012. The reason that we did that was it actually stemmed from a conversation with one of the metropolitans and one of the senior priests in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese around a few higher profile cases of burnout in the Greek Orthodox clergy world. And the question, is this the tip of the iceberg, or are these isolated incidents? So we did a large study at that time in 2012. And what we found then was in that sample, 40% of clergy and clergy spouses in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese were reporting post-traumatic symptoms at a clinical level. Now that's on a self-report instrument. That's, those weren't clinical interviews. Nonetheless, it stunned us. We didn't go into this research thinking trauma was going to be such a prominent aspect of it. But I'll say now that most of what I'll probably end up talking with you about are the impacts of trauma on clergy and clergy families, because clergy and clergy families live in a society now that, because of things like COVID and because of massive societal shifts and polarization and now conflicts on the world stage, there's just a layering and layering and layering and a relentlessness of trauma, which is the world that clergy are serving in and clergy families are living in. So 2012, it was 40%. Subsequently, we've done a study with just clergy wives, presbyteres. In that survey, which was in 2020, we finished it just as COVID was starting. So these really aren't COVID numbers. 46% of clergy spouses were experiencing a minor to moderate level of depressive symptoms. So almost half reported that they were experiencing some kind of depression, and 7 in 10 reported a high level of loneliness. That was like the biggest finding from that. So originally with the group, trauma, then loneliness. Since then, we've done several studies with clergy from other denominations. We're doing a very large study now through the Peel Foundation, and those numbers have gone up, both the mental health symptom numbers and the burnout and traumatization numbers. And I think different trauma impacts differently. So I don't want to say, like, in terms of first responding police and fire or soldiers, that clergy are experiencing higher levels of trauma. I don't think it's fair to like quantify that. But what we have found is it's now up closer to 6 out of 10 clergy are reporting clinically significant levels of post-traumatic stress disorder in their roles as clergy post-COVID.
So how does that number match up with, like, EMTs or those first responders? I mean, obviously there's a different level of what they're experiencing, with the impact that it has on the body, on the psyche, on our emotional health. I mean, are there actual studies to see just the comparison of how, what does that study compare to, an emergency room doctor or a paramedic?
So if we were looking at numbers, the percentage within the field of people experiencing trauma is much higher amongst clergy. That's not saying what kind of trauma it is or how it's impacting them exactly, but that is saying within those professions, clergy are actually much higher than anyone else in the studies that we've done.
So, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, if you think about this sort of really high level of trauma, and then the second problem is loneliness, kind of putting those two things together, that it seems like a lack of support sort of surrounding some of the most crucial and difficult symptoms that people may not have, tools to manage or navigate or even know what it looks like. What would you say you're seeing as a result of this sort of trauma paired with the secondary sort of issue of loneliness and not having that support or not perceiving that they have that support?
Dr. Roxanne, I would think you were sitting on our research team right now, because that is exactly the question we've been asking. And we don't have like a conclusion, but what we think is that for some reason with clergy, that loneliness factor is probably one of the big reasons why the trauma levels are higher.
Yes.
There are different kinds of communities of support and training built around EMTs, emergency room doctors.
Right.
I'm not saying anything about how hard their jobs are. They're wildly difficult, but they're trained to do the traumatic aspects of their jobs. They have others around them who are doing it. Clergy usually don't. As a matter of fact, it's usually the opposite, that in some ways, clergy feel like they have to take things on alone, or just the structure, the systemic nature of being a clergy person is you deal with this on your own. And that is probably one of the things that really amplifies the impacts of the trauma, is the isolation and the lack of training.
Would you agree, Dr. Stavros, that just knowing that, I mean, I'm just speaking obviously on a personal level. I mean, there's times obviously I felt loneliness, and I've been very public about sharing that, especially at times early on in my priesthood, and we were dealing with some challenges that we were dealing with here in Jacksonville. But even when I was at the seminary, there was moments of just kind of just loneliness, and I think sometimes there's this perception that because you're a seminarian, or for that matter, a priest or a clergyman, that you shouldn't be experiencing that. If you were just praying more, if you were just more connected to the scriptures or the church, the writings of the church fathers, that you really wouldn't go through, that you shouldn't be going through this. And perhaps in hearing those kind of negative, really, or faulty, I would say faulty thoughts that we can have, that it further isolates us from getting the kind of help that we need. So much like how you would have in a church where people think that it's a taboo to go say that you need to get counseling in some parishes or in some perspectives that people may have. I think the same is true for clergy, that sometimes it's a sign of weakness. It's a sign of a lack of spirituality that people, that clergy can have. How do you help, I guess, dispel that, or let me back up. I mean, are you seeing a lot of clergy with that come to you that are struggling with just the narrative that they've created in their mind that there must be something wrong with me spiritually for me to have this problem?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you this, here at the Danielsen Institute, anytime a clergy person contacts us and says they would like to receive services here, we rejoice, we celebrate. It's almost like you found us, you made it to us. Okay, now let's start to work on ways that you can start to restore some rhythms and some health and put supports around yourself so that you're not under this kind of siege of trauma and stress by yourself. So I think there are many traditions, for whatever reason, that somehow bracket out psychological health as necessary for spiritual health. It makes absolutely no sense to me that those two things would be seen as separate. And so, when we have a chance to either work with clergy in therapy or present to clergy or share our findings with clergy, it begins with some psychoeducation about the nature of the human body and the human mind and how humans respond, assuming that clergy are actually human, and how humans respond to overwhelming stress. And so by starting with that, it starts to break down some of those assumptions about the having to be superhuman or more than human, or maybe, I don't know, more more somehow like of a spiritual being than a human being, which I don't think that's even good theology, but we do face it a lot.
I love that. If you're just joining us here on Live with the Louhs, we're speaking with Dr. George Stavros. He is the executive director of the Danielsen Institute, and we're talking about clergy wellness, and not only for clergy themselves, but also for their families. We'd love to hear from you. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or you can email us during the live broadcast of our show by emailing me at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com.
So what is the research on sort of the other side that we've sort of, I guess, discovered that sort of help promote the flourishing in clergy in light of this incredible stress and trauma and loneliness? Are there particular things that the research has sort of found that could be or would be helpful to clergy?
Absolutely. That's such an important part of this, because it's pretty easy to get overwhelmed with how much people are suffering. A really cool part of the research has been finding pockets of resilience amidst the trauma and understanding as much as we can where that resilience is coming from. And we found a couple sources of it that are pretty reliable predictors for the groups of people who, even though they're facing the same levels of stress, somehow are not as incapacitated by it, aren't as compromised from a mental health perspective, aren't as traumatized. Because we've done some clergy family research, couple satisfaction is a huge protective factor.
Okay.
So clergy couples who find a way to be a couple and not individual, just individual people within the family, not just mother and father, not just in the Orthodox tradition, priest and matushka, or priest and kuria, or priest and presbytera, but husband and wife. That is a hugely protective factor against the negative impacts of stress and trauma. That came across really clearly. A second factor is something that we've struggled to name, and we've ended up, much to my satisfaction, coming up with a Greek name for it: eudaimonic well-being. And basically the way we're defining that is a sense of meaning and purpose associated with ministry, with family life, and with life in general. People who are able to identify and hold on to and nurture a sense of meaning and purpose in those arenas tend to have some protection against trauma. And as part of that, it's a very relational concept. Meaning and purpose almost always has some strong relational component to it.
Dr. Stavros, I'm kind of curious to say, I know we've been talking obviously about the clergy, the person, the pastor, the priest, but let's spend a little bit of time just talking about the impact of all of this on the spouse. I mean, and specifically on the wife and children. What are we seeing that as far as their level of just loneliness, perhaps even struggles with depression? What are we seeing with the families as well? How are they carrying this load as well?
So there's no question that when we think about this, we would be doing a disservice if we didn't think about it as a family system. And within that system, if there's like a doorway into the system through the priest's vocation for these high levels of stress, then there's often a cascade effect with the whole family. If the clergy person is suffering, what runs the risk of falling by the wayside? Energy, focus, time, availability, the ability to creatively problem solve life's problems, to be present. And what we found in our clergy spouse research was that to the extent that the clergy spouses had some identity in addition to being in the role of the clergy spouse, whether that was work, whether that was being really active within the community with the children and their activities, that was a protective factor for the clergy spouses. But there was a very vulnerable space that opened up with clergy spouses around the stress that was coming into the system through the parish work, through the exposure of their their spouses to it. As I had mentioned before, that resulted in some mental health symptoms, but really the highest importance we thought of findings in that study was the degree of loneliness. And that, again, was particular to clergy spouses whose spouses were serving in communities, because there was a way in which it made it difficult to develop the level of intimacy of friendship that is important for people to not feel lonely. We found there's kind of a formula of low trust plus low intimacy equals loneliness. And the life of so many clergy spouses is one in which they can't really open themselves up too much to people in the community. So there are lower levels of trust that practically they can have, and that then affects the amount of intimacy that they can have, to have an inner circle of friends, easily accessible, easily available. And with those things missing by virtue of their role in, as a clergy spouse, that loneliness really becomes a problem.
So the loneliness is sort of being observed in clergy spouses as well as clergy themselves.
Yes, and I would say it's even a more powerful finding in the spouses than it is in the clergy. It's certainly present in both, but the thing, just from a research perspective, that really caught us by surprise was how high those numbers were. 7 out of 10 reported moderate to high levels of loneliness in their role as a clergy spouse.
And that was protected by identities outside of clergy spouse, correct?
That's
that.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. That was protected by identities outside and by couple satisfaction and by purpose and meaning in life with a very strong relational component. Those are all protective factors.
And was any of this research sort of mediated by generational differences? I mean, was that observed that the sort of newer generation is maybe different than those coming out 20 years ago, 15 years ago, in terms of the model with which they sort of come into ministry?
That is a great question. What we found is not as much as we thought would be the case. What we found, because there was a qualitative component to the research with the clergy spouses, there was a kind of, I don't know, maybe an experiential, wisdom-based acceptance of the struggles in some of the older clergy spouses, say 55 and older. What they did, though, with this, and maybe, so there was a difference, but the difference was those 55 and older validated the experience of the younger ones. They said, that's exactly what we went through too. We just never had anybody ask us about it. And so, I think the younger clergy spouses found that validating to hear from the older ones that this is how it was for them too.
So it's really across the board.
Let me ask you this too, Dr. Stavros, and real quick, everyone, if you're listening to Live with the Louhs, we invite you to call in, speak with Dr. George Stavros, or if you have a question or a comment, the number is 1-855-237-2346. Again, 1-855-237-2346. or email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. Dr. Stavros, I'm kind of curious, as you were sharing that information, if there's any research on the actual, if the size of the community had any relationship to the impact of that we were seeing with regards to trauma, loneliness, maybe even stress within the couple. I mean, was there any research on that, or have we seen any kind of indication that would be a problem?
So I'm going to answer that in a couple ways. First answer is we did not look at a relationship between the size of the community and trauma or burnout. What we did find is that clergy families for whom income was not a major issue had lower levels of trauma, which might not come as, that doesn't mean that always works that way, but that means in the context of a research study, clergy families who had more income were less likely to be experiencing levels of trauma and burnout. Second thing, because this was a Lilly-funded study, one of the things that they were curious about was about finances. Another protective factor for clergy families was financial literacy, was knowing about their retirement, was knowing about their life insurance, was keeping a balanced budget, was having an organized financial life, was actually protective as well. So I don't know if you talk about that as kind of a stewardship of their own resources, but it was a finding in this that was protective. What I will say about the question about communities, relational aggression by parishioners was our highest stressor across the board for both clergy and clergy spouses. So those communities wherein there was just a relentless, aggressive approach towards the clergy and their families created the highest levels of trauma. Not dealing with parishioner suicides, not dealing with divorces, not dealing with the most problematic suffering that they encountered. It was when they were under attack by certain parishioners in a relentless way was the highest traumatizing event for our clergy and their families.
Wow. And I'm so curious about this sort of relational aggression, because it seems to me that, we do find difficult dispositions across, all communities, whether they be work communities, church communities. And is there any training, for clergy on how to deal with a difficult disposition or say a mental health issue in somebody that's making them, aggressive? Is there any sort of initiative to sort of help teach what that looks like, how to recognize it, how to respond in ways that don't fuel the fire, and sort of bring back a level of peace so that clergy can remain their best self and remain led by the Spirit as opposed to kind of fall prey to the flesh? Because I think that's a real struggle without training.
I agree. I don't really know if there is much training either in a seminary context or in a continuing education context, but there certainly is training out there. There's an area of really developed training called conflict fluency, which I think should be taught starting the first year of seminary, because it could provide such valuable skills like you're describing, Dr. Roxanne, to just be prepared. It could probably help with seminary as well. But just to provide the skills and the awareness that this is going to be part of life, and to know how to both diffuse situations when that's possible, how to create firmer boundaries when that's necessary, and how to not be like relentlessly assaulted by that kind of interaction, which I think happens too often. Maybe clergy or their families feel like they have to be available or they have to expose themselves to these things. And it truly is, it was the number one finding of our study.
That is so.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it's not surprising, but I think that, having the, when you have a parishioner or the demographics within that particular community, really are one that tends to be a little more, I guess, for lack of a better word, combative towards the clergy. Obviously you're going to have, if there's not really a support system that priest feels like he has, whether it be within the parish or even outside the parish amongst the hierarchs, that just continuously, kind of compounds that level of just loneliness and despair. And then you add what you were sharing earlier, which I think is just so profound, about the, a correlation between the people that are not necessarily as financially, secure. I mean, you're just looking at all these different things that are coming at them. And I know, as you were saying, Roxanne, I think it's so true that, we're seeing that across the board in a lot of really mission or ministerial type positions. But I do think that, I think it's fair to say that a lot of those other fields, they are trained to deal with these. And I think, at the seminary, I know that we really weren't, kind of dealt with those things, much less dealing with, just dealing with personalities, different personalities. But I think I love the fact that we're having this conversation. And we'd love to hear from you, everyone. If you're interested in talking to Dr. Stavros, call us at 1-855-237-2346 or email us at ask@ancientfaith.com. And I do want to welcome one of our caller. Welcome to Live with the Louhs.
Hi, Father Nick. This is Melinda.
Hi, Melinda.
Hi, Melinda.
Hi, Dr. Roxanne. Hello, Dr. Stavros. I'm listening. I love this. This is just a fascinating conversation. I am actually a priest's wife, and I'm the wife of a retired Navy chaplain. And in the military, and you're probably aware of this, we often observe differences between chaplains who had been soldiers first and then became chaplains. And I don't know if there's any, formal research on that, but I would be so curious to know if you saw any differences between second career clergy, people who had been out in the business world or had done something else and then become priests versus those who were, 20-something, right out of college, right into seminary, got married, and went right into the field, still very early in their grown-up life, so to speak, and whether there were differences in how they handled things and how supported they felt, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. So intuitively, I would say yes, there are differences. That wasn't a formal part of any of the research that we did. But when we look at the protective factors that go along with navigating traumatic stress, if somebody has had a kind of set of life experiences that help them develop a level of relational maturity, emotional intelligence, kind of a realistic approach to problem solving and conflict resolution, my sense is it can't help but serve them as they enter into the really complicated life of a religious community. It's not that somebody who went into it, went straight into to college and straight into seminary, couldn't develop those things. But I think they would have to be much more purposeful in seeking out training and life experience through that track of their formation and development. Because the basic assumptions about what makes a good clergy person, if you're forming them from a high school senior to the time they get ordained, is much different than what creates a robust, functioning, healthy adult who's meeting responsibilities before they ever do that in a ecclesiastical context.
Yeah,
That's
I think
very true.
Yeah. And Dr. Stavros, just so you know that this is Melinda Johnson, who also is the CEO of Ancient Faith Ministries and a very dear friend of ours. And one of the things I think that, just kind of building on what you were sharing, Melinda, is, and maybe addressing to Dr. Stavros had mentioned this earlier in the show, is just the fact that, I know that your husband obviously was in the military and serves as a chaplain now, but I'm wondering of how, how beneficial the training that he received as a soldier is helping him navigate through the as we've been talking about, the trauma, the burnout, the loneliness, the different myriad of emotions that we all face as clergy. I wonder if that's helped him to deal with those as well.
Well, you would have to ask him yourself, and maybe you should. But I think there is certainly a lot of, directly and indirectly, a lot of soldiering. If you survive it, it teaches you that inner strength, right? You have to have a very good sense of meaning, as Dr. Stavros was talking about earlier. And I think of relationships too, whether it's, just between you and God or you and your battle buddies, or, I think it's always interesting to me to see the things that are sort of human universals, right? In any very difficult, very spiritually intense setting. So I would imagine that there are many things about his soldier time that he draws on still. They're part of who he is as a human being.
Right. Melinda, thank you so much for calling in. We love having you.
Oh, my
on the
pleasure.
show.
I'm really enjoying the show, so I'm going to keep listening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Dr. Stavros, I can't help but think of the countless people that are part of parishes who are thinking to themselves as they hear you, as they hear this interview tonight, and they're going, I don't ever think of my priest needing that, or I can't imagine him going through that. What are some really practical ways that you would tell a listener on our show tonight that they can do with their parish priest, that's something that they could speak to their leadership team about? How do we try our best to prevent and to support them?
So I'm gonna dream out loud here, because I realize a lot of these things aren't possible across the board in any sense. But if you could dream about how a community would relate to their priest in a way that promoted that priest's health, it wouldn't be to say don't create any problems. It wouldn't be to say don't have stressful events. That's what they're there for. But it would be to allow the priest and their family to be very clear about downtime and away time from the parish, whether that's days off that are protected, whether that's vacation time that's supported, that's not made more difficult because we can't find a priest to cover, contributing from the parish side to an understanding of healthy boundaries for the priest, so they don't have to fight for everything, that they get to protect their family in that sense. Second thing would be, to the extent that it's possible, have the priest's financial package be solid, predictable, stable, and secure. Don't let there be a question about that. Number 3, sniff out on a community level whether the priest is being exposed to unnecessary bullying dynamics, coercion, manipulation, or threats, implicit or explicit, about, we're going to tell the metropolitan, or we're going to move you, or we're going to cut your pay. It's almost like it's like bystander training in parishes to not let that happen, or to call it out if it is happening. So really, to be supportive about that. Make one other really important one, I think, is build into the priest's role and time continuing education, training, and time with other clergy. And if those things can be combined, so much the better. But training, continuing education, and time with other clergy. What has been made clear abundantly over the past 20 years through the Lilly Foundation and the Greek Orthodox and the Orthodox Church of America have programs like this. Other jurisdictions may as well. Clergy support groups are shown to be as effective a one-stop intervention for diminishing burnout and promoting flourishing in clergy as has been found and developed. Now, it can look different, because for younger clergy, typically they need peers and they need leadership, they need mentorship. Older clergy tend to need they need more the connection with each other, and maybe some coaching or best practices type time together. So it can look a little different depending on the ages of the clergy, but what's absolutely clear is to help diminish burnout, diminish vicarious traumatization, and promote flourishing, which is that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose, that sense of connectedness, that diminishment of loneliness.
I love that.
Clergy peer groups that are respectful, that are confidential, that are not about competition, that are not about criticism, but that are very honest, have been found to be so unbelievably helpful. And there are actually clergy spouse groups that are starting up in a similar vein that are also showing a lot of promise.
I love that. What powerful advice. I want to share with you an email, question that just came in. They wish to remain anonymous. It says, Dr. Stavros, can you address any insights regarding clergy who simultaneously struggle with mental health issues and how they have or have not effectively coped?
Oh, sure. First of all, it's not an uncommon thing. So I want to say that first. Depending on the person, depending on the community, depending on the situation, seeking out and finding quality mental health treatment that understands the unique pressures of being a member of the clergy can be tough. So I think what could help systemically is if communities, whether that's the community itself, whether that's the metropolis working with representatives of communities, whether resources for mental health care can be identified in communities that are the kinds of practitioners that understand the uniqueness of the role and who will hold that, that relationship and role in with a lot of care and confidentiality. That's a dramatically in short supply phenomenon right now. Part of that is the world of mental health. Dr. Roxanne, you're probably aware of this. It's turned into a two-tier system in most places, especially in big cities, but in most places. There are plenty of practitioners who will work for self-pay and not bill insurances, and you can always find somebody like that if you can afford it. The number of practitioners and institutions that can accept just about any insurance, including low-cost insurances, continues to go down as a percentage of available practitioners. And the reimbursement for those services isn't going up, and therefore with inflation, practically is going down. And so there's just not a lot of incentive, unless people are really purpose-driven, to provide low-cost, highest-quality mental health care. So it's a dilemma, but with regard to the question, it's find professional help, seek out this kind of peer support group if possible with other clergy, identify inner circle relationships that can be supportive. And certainly, I'll just throw this in as a trauma-informed additional comment that I think cuts across all of this, is we've lost touch with our bodies as vehicles of healing. Our bodies need the chance to be bodies, to be vigorous, to move, to breathe, to sweat, to have our blood pressure go up with activity, to have our heart rates go up. Without a regular rhythm of a body being allowed to be a body, all the stuff that we're talking about diminishes in its effectiveness considerably.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it's one of the biggest things. I love I love the entire presentation that you're giving, Dr. George, because I think I'm sure that there are pastors and priests who are listening to you tonight that are like going, yes, yes, yes. And I know for me personally, running and going to the gym frequently has been extraordinarily therapeutic for me, just mind, body, soul, every aspect of it. So I agree totally with what you were just sharing.
I mean, I just love that this is being echoed in such a loud way. I mean, I think a lot of times we think of, self-care and movement and physical activity and boundaries as sort of, accessories, not necessities. It's sort of like, okay, at the end of the day, maybe if I have time, but I don't, because there's so many other things, and life is never going to slow down enough for you to make that room, especially in clergy. I mean, so many of the responses I read, from the research collected from the priests' wives, was that there is not an off day, and the off day is ultimately used for other clergy activity, and this is the real struggle. And I even read, one priest's wife said, even though it's not intended for the church to come first, it quote unquote does, even when it's not intended, just because of the nature of the position being, constant and on. And so I just love the importance of all of these, what I would say, boundaries around, things that keep us healthy and whole, so the body can be a vehicle of healing. I mean, let's face it, our soul resides within this body of ours, right? And so I'm just, we need to have you come on regularly, Dr. George.
Right.
It's such an important message.
Yes, and as you gather more, research, Dr. Stavros, I would definitely love to have you back on. I think it would be great I know it would be great for our listeners, but also just great for them not only to hear those studies, but also to see the great work that you guys are doing. But we only have a few minutes left, just about 3 minutes left. If there's a clergyman that's listening to our show tonight, who is experiencing burnt out, he's burnout or she is burnout, whatever denomination or that they may be part of, what do you suggest for them? What are some resources for them to utilize today?
So I'm going to give a couple specific ones. One is Father Alex Kusetis at the Center for Family Care at the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese is putting together clergy support groups. I think Dr. Albert Rossi was helping with the OCA program of clergy support groups, but they're out there. That's low-hanging fruit. Just call Father Alex or email him at the Center for Family Care. Say you're interested in being part of one of those support groups, and he will work to get you connected. So that would be one. The second resource is right now at the Danielsen Institute, we have a grant-funded program for clergy, for chaplains, and for psychotherapists who are experiencing burnout to join Zoom-based support groups that are designed to help with burnout and vicarious traumatization and to promote flourishing.
Now, this is in any denomination. This is for any denomination.
This is any denomination, and it includes chaplains and therapists too.
Perfect.
So just go to our website at Boston University. It's the Danielsen Institute, and you'll be able to find a way to inquire about those. The third thing is, if to do something right now or to do something in the morning. I just want to go back to this idea of start with the body, and I mean it's the chemicals that our body releases into our bloodstreams when we're vigorously active are so much higher quality and so much more reliable and so perfectly designed for us to make us feel better. And they're the things that psychiatric medications try to impact, the same systems. Serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin get released by vigorous exercise. And the chemicals in our body, the stress hormones that get broken down by physical exercise, cortisol especially, gets eliminated from the bloodstream through vigorous exercise. There's no finer, more efficient system to get those chemicals into our bloodstream that we need and to get the ones out that we don't need than moving our bodies. So it's, just a shameless plug to do that. There's no downside.
Absolutely.
I am so grateful for you, Dr. George, on a personal level, but also just in your words tonight. And I definitely would love to have you. I know Roxanne and I would both love to have you back on our show. But I know you took time away from your family, and just we want you to know how grateful we are that you've joined us tonight. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for
Well, thank you for
work.
inviting me in. Oh, thanks so much.
Absolutely.
And thank you for the work that two of you are doing, making such a big difference.
Well, glory to God. Thank you so much, brother. We also want to thank Matushka Trudy for producing tonight's show. It was quite an ordeal prior to getting onto the show tonight. Unfortunately, Roxanne is here with me, but unfortunately, the equipment that we were using was not working. But nevertheless, we are so grateful that Matushka Trudy produced tonight's show. And again, as we mentioned at the top of the show, just stay connected to us. Just join our social media platforms. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. And next Tuesday, we're going to do a special Live with the Louhs. We're going to be talking about how do we cope with the stress of today's news. I know for many of us, we're watching the news and we can be filled with so much stress, so much anxiety. We're watching in many ways this trauma taking place around the world, and really specifically what we're seeing in the Ukraine and in Palestine and in Israel. How is that impacting us, and what are we called to do about it? It'll be a special Live with the Louhs. We hope that you'll join us. That's next Tuesday when we cover coping with stress of today's news. God bless you, my friends, and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.